Cueva de Ardales. The reddish stains on the stalagmites had been there for as long as anyone could remember. For nearly 2 centuries after the cave's rediscovery in 1821, scientists assumed they were natural, just iron oxide deposited by slow-moving water, the cave doing what caves do across millennia of quiet geological time. Then a research team decided to actually measure them. What they found was not a mineral deposit. The pigment had not been carried by water. It had been pressed onto the stone by a hand. A deliberate hand. A hand that had reached into the darkness of this cave 65,000 years ago, ground red ochre into powder, mixed it with a binder, and applied it to cold limestone with intention. And 65,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had not yet set foot anywhere in Europe. So the only hominid in southern Spain at that moment was Homo neanderthalensis. A Neanderthal made that mark. Cueva de Ardales sits in the Malaga province of Andalusia in southern Spain, a cave known since Roman times, its entrance reopened by an earthquake in 1821 when explorer Don Trinidad de Rojas first documented its painted walls. The cave contains hundreds of Paleolithic paintings, bison, deer, geometric forms, hands pressed in silhouette against stone. For generations, the reddish stains on several of the cave's stalagmites were treated as geological background noise, natural formations in a site otherwise full of undeniably human art. That assumption collapsed in 2021 when a team led by Dr. Joan Sillon of the University of Barcelona and Dr. Francesco D'Errico of the University of Bordeaux published their uranium-thorium dating results in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. 25 calcite samples collected from over and adjacent to the pigment zones were analyzed. The results gave minimum ages for the pigment beneath. The oldest samples came back at approximately 65,000 years before the present. Some were potentially older still. The uranium-thorium dating method works by measuring the radioactive decay of uranium into thorium within calcium carbonate crusts that form over painted surfaces. These crusts give minimum ages, meaning the art is at least as old as the date returned, and likely older. What the 2021 study confirmed was that pigment had been applied to Ardales' stalagmites before those calcite crusts formed over them, placing the act of pigment application firmly in Neanderthal time. Homo sapiens is not documented in Western Europe before approximately 43,000 to 41,000 years ago, based on current fossil and genetic evidence. The oldest Ardales pigment predates that arrival by a minimum of 22,000 years. The mathematics of human prehistory leaves only one candidate, but the date alone is not the most disquieting part. What the study also revealed is that the pigment was not applied once. Multiple stalagmites across different chambers of the cave show similar red ochre markings dating to different periods within that 65,000-year span, spread across an estimated 25,000 years of repeated application. Neanderthals were not making a single accidental mark. They were returning to this cave, generation after generation, to repigment the same formations. That is not instinct. That is not coincidence. That is tradition, the deliberate transmission of meaning from one generation to the next. They're sustained across a time span longer than the entirety of recorded human civilization. Dr. Zilho, who had argued since the 1990s that Neanderthal symbolic behavior was being systematically underestimated, watched his once fringe position become empirical fact. The pigment itself was confirmed by spectroscopic analysis to be artificially applied rather than naturally deposited. Its distribution, the pattern is inconsistent with hydrological staining, the telltale signature of water carrying minerals through stone. Someone mixed this material and placed it deliberately. ochre used by Neanderthals has now been documented at sites including Maastricht Belvedere in the Netherlands and Cueva de los Aviones in Spain, confirming that pigment handling was not a one-cave anomaly, but a widespread Neanderthal behavior stretching back at least 250,000 years. They were not accidentally stumbling into pigment. They knew what it was. They sought it out. The mainstream response to these findings has been significant and, by scientific standards, relatively swift. The field has largely accepted the Neanderthal attribution and revised its framework accordingly. The model has shifted from a linear narrative in which art making was an exclusively modern human behavior toward what some researchers now call a braided stream model, one in which multiple hominid populations engaged in symbolic behavior, potentially influencing one another across tens of thousands of years of proximity, and, as the Denisova findings confirm, actual interbreeding. Neanderthals are no longer the grunting brutes of the popular imagination. The data has retired that image. But accepting that Neanderthals made art does not fully account for what our dailies reveals. A tradition maintained for 25,000 years requires something more than cognitive capacity. It requires the ability to convey to your children and their children and their children's children across 1,000 generations that this cave matters, and that these stone formations are significant, that the act of marking them carries meaning that must be preserved. That is culture, not proto-culture, not a precursor to culture, but culture in the fullest sense of the word. And if Neanderthals had that, if they were capable of sustaining a sacred tradition across a span of time that dwarfs all of written history, then what else have we been crediting exclusively to ourselves? Some researchers in paleoanthropology now ask openly whether the cognitive gap between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens was ever as large as assumed, or whether the gap was always a narrative we built to protect a particular story about who we are. Ardales doesn't answer that question. It just makes it impossible to avoid. What ended the tradition in this cave? Was it climate pressure, the demographic expansion of incoming Homo sapiens populations, or something else entirely? We don't know. The last red mark was pressed onto limestone in the dark by someone whose descendants we are, in ways the genome has only recently begun to confirm. They were here. They cared about something enough to come back to it for 25,000 years. And they left the evidence in a cave that we almost decided was just stained by water. From a cave in southern Spain, where the last impossible question is still echoing off the walls, we cross the Atlantic to the Nevada desert, where a different kind of silence has settled over a discovery that matched a prophecy no archaeologist had bothered to read before they started digging. Lovelock Cave. 22 miles south of the town of Lovelock in the high desert of Pershing County, Nevada, there is a volcanic cave that the Paiute people of the region have known about for longer than written history reaches. They called the people who had lived there the Si-Te-Ka, a word meaning, roughly, tule eaters, though the oral tradition describes them as something more than merely a neighboring people. The Paiute accounts is documented in writing by ethnographer Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins in her 1883 autobiography, Life Among the Paiutes, Their Wrongs and Claims, described the Si-Te-Ka as a race of red-haired, cannibalistic enemies, taller than ordinary people who terrorized the tribes of the Great Basin until a coalition of tribes trapped them in a cave, piled brush at the entrance, and burned them. That book was published 29 years before archaeologists first excavated the cave. When they did, they found red-haired mummies, the remains of large individuals, and thousands of artifacts. The Paiute had been describing this cave, these people, and this ending for generations before anyone with a trowel showed up to confirm it. The cave's archaeological story begins in 1912, not with a university expedition but with a mining operation. A company began extracting bat guano from Lovelock Cave for use as agricultural fertilizer, removing approximately 250 tons of material in the process. As the guano came out, artifacts began surfacing, and eventually L.L. Loud of the University of California was brought in to conduct a formal excavation in 1912. M.R. Harrington followed with a second excavation in 1924. Their findings were jointly published in 1929 as Lovelock Cave, an official University of California publication that documented approximately 10,000 artifacts recovered from the site and the mummified and desiccated human remains found throughout the cave's layers. Among those artifacts were 11 tool reed duck decoys, stuffed with plant material, painted with pigment to mimic the coloring of canvasback ducks, and constructed with a technical sophistication that modern decoy carvers have described as remarkable. These are the oldest known waterfowl decoys in North America. Radiocarbon dating places them at approximately 2000 BCE, making them roughly 4,000 years old, the product of a hunting culture operating in the Great Basin at a level of craftsmanship that the standard archaeological model of Great Basin prehistoric peoples does not easily accommodate. They are not crude approximations. They are purpose-built hunting tools of a high order, requiring knowledge of duck anatomy, behavior, and visual perception, combined with the fiber working technology to realize that knowledge in physical form. The human remains from the cave included individuals described in the official Loud and Harrington 1929 report as having reddish or auburn-colored hair. The authors noted this in the published record themselves, not in a fringe publication, but in a University of California academic monograph. The mainstream explanation for the reddish coloration is a well-documented chemical process. Dark human hair frequently shifts to reddish or auburn tones under alkaline conditions, desiccation, or heat exposure, all of which were present in the cave's environment. This explanation is scientifically sound and should not be dismissed. Skeletal measurements from the cave also suggested statures slightly above the documented average for Great Basin prehistoric populations, though the sample size is too fragmentary for statistical significance, and this point should be treated with appropriate caution. What is harder to explain away is the specificity of the Paiute oral tradition's match to the physical reality of the site. Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins was not writing about a generic cave or a vague ancestral enemy. She described people with red hair in a cave defeated by a coalition of tribes through fire. The cave exists. The fire evidence exists at the entrance. The reddish-haired remains exist in the official excavation record. The tradition predates the excavation by nearly 3 decades. Anthropologists who study oral history transmission have increasingly argued that indigenous oral traditions frequently encode genuine historical events with a precision and durability that Western scholarship was slow to credit. The Lovelock case is one of the most striking documented examples of an oral tradition and an archaeological site saying the same thing in different languages without either one having access to the other. Comprehensive genomic analysis of the Lovelock Cave remains has not been fully published as of this writing, partly due to repatriation considerations under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Without that data, the physical characteristics of the remains remain without definitive biological explanation. Some researchers ask whether the remains represent a genetically distinct population that occupied the Great Basin before the ancestors of the Paiute arrived, a prior people whose memory survived in oral tradition precisely because the conflict that ended them was traumatic enough to transmit across generations. Others maintain that the evidence, taken in full, is consistent with known Great Basin populations and that the oral tradition's apparent specificity is a coincidence elevated by selective reading. The truth of what happened in that cave, and to whom, remains genuinely unresolved. What is not in dispute is that someone in the Nevada desert 4,000 years ago was making duck decoys of a quality that surprises experts today, living in a cave that an indigenous oral tradition later described in terms that matched the archaeological record with uncomfortable precision, and that the remains they left behind have generated more questions than the official excavation was designed to ask. From the Nevada desert, and a prophecy fulfilled too late to matter, we travel northeast into the mountains of Siberia, where a discovery made from a fragment of bone smaller than your thumbnail erased an entire chapter of the human family tree and rewrote it from scratch: Denisova Cave. The Altai Mountains of southern Russia sit at the intersection of what are now Russia, Mongolia, China, and Kazakhstan, and 700 meters above sea level, a limestone cave opens above the confluence of two rivers. Russian archaeologists had been excavating it since the 1970s without finding anything to suggest it was more significant than the dozens of other Paleolithic sites in the region. Then in 2008, a small bone emerged from the cave's east gallery. It was the distal phalanx, the outermost segment of a child's little finger. It was sent to Svante Pääbo's ancient DNA laboratory at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, where researchers expected to sequence Neanderthal DNA. They did not find Neanderthal DNA. They found something that no living scientist had a name for. The paper Pääbo's team published in Nature in 2010 announced that the finger bone's genome belonged to an entirely unknown archaic human group, a population that had diverged from the lineage leading to both Neanderthals and modern humans approximately 1 million years ago, far older than the Neanderthal Homo sapiens split of roughly 600,000 to 800,000 years ago. The cave had housed this unknown group, which was immediately named Denisovans after the cave's name. It had also housed Neanderthals, and it had housed Homo sapiens. 3 distinct human species in a single cave. The family tree humanity had been drawing for over a century turned out to be missing an entire branch. The physical evidence for the Denisovans even now remains extraordinarily sparse. A handful of teeth, a partial jaw, and a few bone fragments constitute nearly the entire fossil record. But the genome extracted from those fragments told a story that fossils alone never could have. Denisovan DNA survives in living human populations today, concentrated most heavily in Melanesian and Aboriginal Australian peoples, who carry between 4 and 6% Denisovan DNA in their genomes, and in Tibetan populations, who carry a specific Denisovan gene variant called EPAS, one that allows their bodies to function efficiently at high altitude. That gene, colloquially called the super athlete gene, was not developed by Tibetan Homo sapiens independently. It was inherited from Denisovans who had adapted to high-altitude environments, a finding confirmed by the identification of a Denisovan mandible, a jawbone, at an archaeological site in Tibet called Siahi at an elevation of 3,280 meters, published in Nature in 2019. Then, in 2018, a paper in Nature announced Denisova 11, a bone fragment from a girl approximately 13 years old whose genome revealed that her mother was a Neanderthal and her father was a Denisovan. She was the first directly identified first-generation interspecies hybrid in the entire archaeological record. Her existence confirmed that these populations were not merely coexisting in the same cave in different time periods, they were meeting, interacting, and having children together. The human story, at least in this cave, was not a story of separate species passing like ships. It was a story of contact, combination, and consequence that still echoes in the genomes of billions of living people. Sediment analysis and ancient DNA extracted from cave soil layers indicate that Denisovans occupied Denisova Cave from approximately 200,000 years ago. A decorated bone pendant and a polished chloridolite bracelet found in the cave's Denisovan layers, dated to approximately 50,000 years ago, are among the oldest personal ornaments ever recovered anywhere on Earth. Svante Pääbo was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022 explicitly for discoveries concerning the genomes of extinct hominins, a Nobel Prize awarded in significant part because of a child's fingertip found in a Siberian cave. The mainstream response has been to integrate the Denisovan discovery into an updated model of human prehistory, one that replaces the old linear progression narrative with what David Reich of Harvard Medical School, writing in Who We Are and How We Got Here, describes as a pattern of repeated interbreeding between archaic populations across enormous geographic ranges. The braided stream replaces the family tree. Denisovans are no longer a footnote. They are a chapter. But here is the question the Nobel Prize does not answer. If an entire human species, one that ranged from Siberia to Tibet to Southeast Asia to Melanesia, could be invisible to science until 2010, known only from a child's fingertip, how many other populations are out there in the sediment, unnamed and uncounted? The Denisovan physical fossil record is so thin that their appearance has been reconstructed primarily from DNA methylation patterns rather than actual bone structure. We have a genome, we barely have a skeleton, and they interbred with our ancestors for tens of thousands of years across half the planet. From a Siberian cave that revealed a species we had no name for, we descend into water, traveling west to China, where a network of rooms the size of cathedrals was carved into the earth by someone who apparently did not exist. Longyu Caves. In June of 1992, a farmer named Wu Anai in Xi'an Bacon Village in Zhejiang Province, China, grew tired of a pond on his land and decided to pump it out. He ran the pump for 24 days. What appeared beneath the water when it was finally gone was not a pond floor. It was a ceiling, the ceiling of an enormous hand-carved stone chamber, its walls and surfaces covered in perfectly parallel chisel marks descending into echoing darkness below. Wu Anai had found one room. There were 24 more beneath his village's cluster of ponds. The Zhejiang Provincial Institute of Cultural Relics and Archaeology moved in quickly, and as pond after pond was pumped dry across the village, more chambers appeared. 24 individual artificial caves, each one enormous, each one hand-carved from the region's siltstone bedrock, each one sharing an identical interior surface treatment. Parallel chisel marks arranged at exactly 60 degrees to horizontal, consistent across all chambers, covering walls, ceilings, and the pillars left standing to support the roofs. The caves average between 30 and 40 meters in height. The largest individual chamber covers approximately 1,200 square meters of floor space, roughly the footprint of a large church, with the ceiling rising to the height of a 5-story building, entirely underground. The total excavated area across all 24 caves is estimated at 30,000 square meters. To carve these chambers by hand required the removal of an estimated 1 million cubic meters of siltstone. At the productivity achievable with Iron Age hand tools, this represents thousands of workers laboring for years. China, during any period in which this scale of organized labor was possible, the Qin dynasty, the Han dynasty, the Warring States period, was a civilization of meticulous bureaucratic record-keeping. Imperial projects of this magnitude generated documentation, labor requisitions, material inventories, administrative correspondence, local gazetters, folk memory, dynastic histories. Across the entirety of the Chinese written record, no document in any archive has ever been found that mentions the Longyu caves, not their construction, not their purpose, not a single worker's name, not a single administrative note, the largest known man-made cave complex in China, and the civilization that built it apparently chose not to write it down. Archaeological analysis confirmed the caves were excavated downward through the hillside from above, and the pillars following a precise grid pattern suggest architectural planning of a formal kind, not improvised quarrying. The chisel-mark pattern style bears resemblance to decorative treatments found on pottery, terraces, and stone objects from the Qin dynasty period, roughly 221 to 206 BCE, suggesting a possible dating window. But this remains unconfirmed and is contested. A joint study team from Japan, China, and Poland, initiated in 2000, spent years attempting to determine construction date and purpose through physical analysis, sediment sampling, and architectural modeling, and concluded without publishing a definitive answer to either question. No tools have been found inside the caves, no human remains, no pottery consistent with habitation or storage use, no waste material from the carving process, and no quarry fill. The 1 million cubic meters of siltstone that came out of these chambers has never been systematically located in the region's construction history. It should be findable in road fill, building foundations, or landscape features somewhere within a reasonable transport radius. It has not been found. The mainstream explanation proposes the caves were either quarries for construction stone or large-scale underground storage facilities, possibly for military grain or administrative goods, associated with state projects of the imperial period that routinely mobilized enormous conscript workforces. This is a reasonable framework, but it struggles with several things simultaneously: the missing stone, the missing records, the decorative precision of the chisel pattern in a material that would have made plain functional chambers perfectly adequate, and the complete absence of any artifact indicating what the caves were used for after they were built. Storage facilities leave traces of what was stored. These chambers left nothing. Structural engineers who have visited the site have noted that the 60-degree chisel pattern, the specific column, placement, and the ceiling geometry create chambers with unusual acoustic properties, resonant in ways that would make them effective for large communal gatherings or ritual performance rather than storage. Others have pointed to alignments between the cave system and local landscape features that held ceremonial significance in pre-Qin cultural traditions. Some researchers ask whether the absence from the historical record is not a failure of documentation, but a deliberate omission, whether the caves served a purpose that the civilization which built them had reasons to leave unwritten. Whatever those reasons were, they held. The silence in the record is as precise as the chisel marks on the walls. From a cave complex that history refused to record, we cross the Pacific and descend into the jungle of South America, where a British expedition, including a man who had walked on the moon, went looking for something that the official report afterward declined to fully explain. Cueva de los Tallos. The year is 1976. A joint British-Ecuadorian expedition, formally co-organized by the British Army and the Ecuadorian government, is preparing to descend into a cave system in the Cordillera del Condor in eastern Ecuador, deep in the territory of the Shuar indigenous people. The team includes 22 specialists across geology, botany, archaeology, and cartography. It also includes Neil Armstrong, the first human being to walk on the surface of the moon, who has accepted an invitation to join the expedition as an honorary member. The cave is accessible only through a vertical entrance shaft, entered by rope in near total darkness. E. Armstrong descends. The official expedition report, when it is published, surveys approximately 2.16 kilometers of cave passage, documents nesting sites of thousands of oil birds called tyos, the source of the cave's name, and finds no metal library. The report does not fully explain why Neil Armstrong was there. The trigger for the expedition was a Hungarian-Argentine explorer named János Moric, who in 1969 filed a notarized legal affidavit with Ecuadorian authorities claiming to have discovered a vast subterranean tunnel system beneath the Ecuadorian jungle containing a metal library. Hundreds of golden tablets inscribed with an unknown pictographic script, alongside stone and metal sculptures suggesting contact between the ancient world and pre-Columbian South America. Moric brought his claims to Swiss author Erich von Däniken, who featured them prominently in his 1972 book The Gold of the Gods, which became an international sensation. The notarized affidavit, a legal document with real consequences for a false claim, has been reviewed by journalist and researcher Philip Coppens, who confirmed its existence and legal validity. Moric was not writing an anecdote. He was making a sworn legal declaration of discovery. The cave system Moric described is physically real. The Shuar people of the region have traditional knowledge of Cueva de los Tallos extending back through their oral history, and they treat it as a sacred site. Their tradition describes the cave as a repository of ancestral knowledge. Ethnographers, including Dr. Richard Evans Schultes of Harvard, documented Shuar relationships to the cave system as part of broader ethnographic work in the region, though the specific metal tablet tradition was not his focus. Scottish explorer Stan Hall, who organized the British side of the 1976 expedition and later wrote the most comprehensive account of the cave in his 2000 book Taos Gold, believed the cave system extended far beyond what was mapped, and that Moric had accessed a different section through a different entry point than the one used by the official expedition. This matters because the 1976 expedition explicitly noted that the section of cave system Moric described entering in 1969 was not fully surveyed during their work. The full extent of the Cueva de los Tallos network remains unmapped to this day. What the expedition confirmed is that Moric was correct about the cave's existence, its approximate location, and its extraordinary physical character. What it could neither confirm nor deny is what lies in the portions of the system it did not reach. The cave's physical interior is itself remarkable. Cavers and researchers who have entered it describe chambers with naturally flat floors, cathedral-scale ceiling heights, and a spatial organization that trained spelunkers have called startling, as though the cave's natural formation happened to produce something architecturally coherent. Independent researcher Bruce Fenton documented anomalous acoustic properties in certain chambers and noted specific carved niches in the cave walls that appear artificial rather than naturally formed, though no peer-reviewed study has formally examined these specific claims. Ecuadorian archaeologist Oswaldo Tobar has proposed that the cave system was used by pre-Columbian cultures for ceremonial and possibly archival purposes, and that whatever material evidence of that use once existed may have been removed before the Spanish conquest, or may remain in chambers that no outside expedition has entered. The metal library, as Moric described it, may represent a mythologized version of an oral tradition about knowledge-keeping, a real practice of archiving information in durable materials that has taken on its most dramatic form in the retelling. Or it may be precisely what he said it was, in a part of the cave that no scientific team has yet reached. The question that lingers around the 1976 expedition is not about the metal library. It is about Neil Armstrong. A man who had been to the moon descended into a jungle cave, in Ecuador by rope, in the dark, voluntarily, as part of a formally organized scientific expedition. Whatever he believed he was going there to find, he went. The record documents the descent. It does not document what he was thinking when he climbed back out. From a cave that the modern world is still trying to fully enter, we travel north and east, back to France, where the most inaccessible room in the most famous cave in the world holds the oldest story ever told, painted by someone who descended on a rope to put it there. The Lascaux Shaft Scene. Lascaux Cave in the Dordogne region of France was discovered on September 12, 1940, by a teenager named Marcel Ravidat and 3 companions who followed their dog into a hole in the ground and found themselves standing before walls covered in paintings of such scale and beauty that their first report was initially disbelieved. The cave's galleries contain some of the most extraordinary Paleolithic art ever documented. Horses in flowing motion, bulls whose scale fills entire walls, deer crossing a river in a procession of antlers that seems to breathe. These paintings have been dated to approximately 17,000 BCE, and they draw visitors and researchers from around the world. But there is a room in Lascaux that most visitors never see and most accounts of the cave do not linger on. It is called the shaft, le puits in French, a vertical drop of approximately 5 meters below the main painted galleries. You get there by rope. You drop into a narrow chamber that smells of old limestone and enclosure, where a torch or lamp is required even now, and where the paintings on the walls are notably rougher, less refined than the masterworks above. And there, in that difficult dark, is the only scene in all of Lascaux that tells a story. A wounded bison, its entrails spilling from a spear wound in its flank, is turning. A human figure is falling or lying prone, rendered with a bird's head or a bird head mask, its body simplified to near abstraction. To the side stands a staff topped with a bird figure. These 3 elements, the dying animal, the fallen bird-headed person, the bird on the staff, are arranged in deliberate spatial relationship to one another. They are not decorative, they are narrative. They depict a moment, a sequence, a meaning that someone climbed down a rope into the dark specifically to record. Radiocarbon dating of organic material from the shaft places the scene's creation at approximately 17,000 to 15,000 BCE, consistent with the main gallery dates. The deliberateness of its placement in the cave's most inaccessible chamber is not incidental. Reaching it during the site's occupation would have required rope, a reliable light source, and specific intent. This was not painted for casual viewing. It was placed here for a reason that required the difficulty of access. The bird-headed human figure has drawn the attention of comparative religion scholars for decades. Paleoanthropologist David Lewis Williams of the University of the Witwatersrand, in his landmark 2002 book, The Mind in the Cave, argues that the shaft scene depicts a shamanic cosmological transition, a specialist practitioner crossing between the physical world and the spirit realm, or with the shaft descent itself representing a physical enactment of that crossing into an underworld. The bird-headed figure, in Lewis Williams's analysis, is a person in a state of trance or death, marked by the bird as the vehicle of spirit world travel. This interpretation is not an archaeological novelty. Bird figures as markers of the transition between the living world and what lies beyond it appear in shamanic iconography documented by comparative religion, scholar Mircea Eliade in his foundational 1951 study, Shamanism. Archaic techniques of ecstasy across Siberian, Native American, Central Asian, and South African traditions independently developed cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, all using the bird in the same symbolic role. German researcher Dr. Michael Rappenglueck proposed in a 1999 study that the composition of the shaft seen maps the positions of three stars in the constellation Cygnus as they appeared approximately 17,000 years ago, and that the bird on the staff specifically represents the star Deneb. This astronomical interpretation remains contested in the peer literature and should be treated as a hypothesis rather than a conclusion. What is less contested is that the scene's three elements, the animal, the human, and the bird, form a compositional unit with intentional internal relationships, and that those relationships carry symbolic weight rather than purely descriptive documentation of a hunting event. The mainstream interpretation treats the shaft scene as a hunting record, a commemoration of a specific man killed or knocked down by a wounded animal, with the bird head attributed to a ritual mask or costume worn during ceremony consistent with documented practices in later cultures, and the bird staff interpreted as a ritual fetish. This reading is coherent and grounded in reasonable analogy, but it does not account for the placement. Hunting records are painted in the galleries where people gather. Stories meant for private ritual are painted in the place you can only reach by going down. If the shaft scene represents a cosmological system, a set of beliefs about what happens when life ends and where the human spirit travels, then it is not merely the oldest narrative image in the archaeological record. It is evidence of an organized spiritual worldview at least 17,000 years old, encoded in a chamber entered by deliberate descent into the earth using symbolic vocabulary that survived independently in cultures across the entire inhabited world. The person who made it knew exactly what they were doing. They went down into the dark to put it exactly there. 17,000 years later, we are still arguing about what they meant. From the depths of Lascaux and its impossible story, we travel east, crossing Europe to a Bulgarian cave where the art on the walls is made not from ochre or charcoal, but from bat droppings, and where the patterns left behind may encode a calendar accurate to 365 days. Thousands of years before any civilization is supposed to have known how to count them. Magura Cave. In the mountain range known as Vratsa Balkan in northwestern Bulgaria, near the town of Belogradchik, a cave stretches for 2.5 kilometers through the limestone. It has been known to local people for centuries, and it was first investigated archaeologically in the mid-20th century by Bulgarian archaeologists, including Vasil Mikov of the National Institute of Archaeology of the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. What they found on its walls is unlike any other painted cave in Europe. The pigment used to create more than 700 images across the cave's surfaces is not ochre. It is not charcoal. It is bat guano, the cave's own accumulated organic matter. They're mixed with water to create a durable brown pigment that has adhered to the limestone for thousands of years with a tenacity that many ochre-based cave paintings have not matched. The paintings have been dated by stylistic analysis and stratigraphic context to multiple periods spanning roughly 8,000 to 2,000 BCE, suggesting the cave was actively used as a painted space across approximately 6,000 years of human activity, a span of continuous cultural engagement with a single site that is itself remarkable. The images include human figures in apparent ritual dances, arms extended, in processional groupings that suggest organized communal ceremony. They include animals, plants, and geometric forms, and they include sequences of markings, sun-like symbols, repeated figures, and grouped counting marks that Bulgarian researcher Tony Tashev has analyzed as encoding a solar calendar of 365 days with groupings that correspond to solstices, equinoxes, and the division of the year into recognizable seasonal segments. If the calendar interpretation is correct, it is extraordinary in its implications. The Sumerians of Mesopotamia developed the first acknowledged written calendar systems around 3000 BCE. Egyptian calendrical organization follows a similar timeline. The oldest Magura paintings predate these systems by thousands of years. The ability to count 365 days in a repeating annual cycle and encode that count in a systematic, readable format represents a level of astronomical observation and abstract numerical thinking that the conventional timeline of human cognitive development assigns to the literate urban civilizations of the ancient Near East, not to the cave painting cultures of prehistoric Europe. One specific chamber within Magura has been proposed to function as a natural solar observatory. At the winter solstice, light entering through a particular opening in the cave illuminates a specific painted panel on the far wall opposite, an alignment that, if intentional, would make the cave a seasonally oriented ritual site designed around the sun's annual cycle. This alignment claim requires careful on-site astronomical measurement to fully evaluate, and its intentionality remains debated. But it is not an isolated claim in the study of prehistoric sites. Intentional solar alignments are now documented at Newgrange in Ireland, at Stonehenge in England, and at numerous megalithic structures across Europe, confirming that the ability to identify and architecturally capture solar turning points was within the cognitive reach of prehistoric communities well before writing. The use of bat guano as the specific painting medium is unique to Magura among documented European cave art sites. Ochre, charcoal, manganese dioxide, and hematite are the standard pigment materials of Paleolithic cave art. The Magura artist's choice of bat guano could be functional, a material that was locally abundant and proved chemically stable on limestone. But the choice of the cave's own organic material, produced by the creatures of the underground dark, as the medium for recording knowledge about the sky and the sun is a juxtaposition that some researchers find too deliberate to dismiss as purely practical. The underworld and the cosmos recorded in the same marks, in the same darkness. The mainstream archaeological position treats Magura as an important Chalcolithic and Bronze Age religious and ceremonial site, with the paintings representing ritual imagery that may include symbolic seasonal counts related to agriculture or hunting cycles. The calendar interpretation is noted in the literature, but treated with caution, as pattern seeking in prehistoric numerical groupings is a known methodological hazard, and correspondence to 365 does not by itself confirm intentional calendrical encoding. These are fair objections. They are also, some researchers point out, objections that are applied to Magura with a consistency that is not always matched when evaluating comparable claims at sites with more established institutional prestige. What no one disputes is that someone returned to this cave for 6,000 years to paint. 6,000 years of deliberate engagement with a single underground space, using a uniquely chosen medium, leaving behind a visual record that includes organized numerical groupings and a possible astronomical alignment. Whatever they were doing in Magura, they considered it worth doing across a span of time longer than the entire history of ancient Rome from its founding to its fall. From a Bulgarian cave where the cosmos was recorded in darkness, we cross the Atlantic to the Pacific coast of South America and then south, arriving in Argentina, where 9,000 years ago someone pressed their hands against a cave wall and left behind a record that raises a question nobody in the mainstream record has satisfactorily answered. Cueva de las Manos. In the Patagonian steppe of Santa Cruz province in southern Argentina, where the wind comes off the Andes without obstacle and the Rio Pinturas has carved a canyon through ancient volcanic rock, a cave opens in the canyon wall that contains one of the most visually overwhelming concentrations of prehistoric art in the Americas. Its name means Cave of the Hands, and that name is precise. The walls of Cueva de las Manos are covered in hundreds of stenciled human handprints made by pressing a hand against the rock and blowing pigment around it through a tube, leaving the hand's outline in negative against the stone. The technique is identical to methods documented independently in caves in Spain, France, Australia, and Indonesia. The hands cover the cave's walls in overlapping layers of color, ochre and iron oxide in reds, oranges, yellows, and blacks, creating a surface that looks, from a distance, feel like something between a declaration and a crowd. The cave was formally documented and studied by Carlos Gradin and colleagues beginning in the 1970 OS, and radiocarbon dating of organic material within the painted layers established dates ranging from approximately 7000 BCE to 1300 CE, confirming that the site was actively used across more than 8,000 years. The earliest layers, dated to approximately 9,000 years before the present, contain the oldest confirmed human images in South America. UNESCO designated the site a World Heritage Location in 1999 in recognition of its extraordinary cultural and historical significance. Within the hundreds of handprints at Cueva de las Manos, a significant subset appear to show hands that are not anatomically complete. Multiple stencils display what appear to be missing fingers or partial hands, with the absence of one or more digits clearly visible in the negative outline. The official documentation by Gradin and subsequent researchers noted these anomalous prints. They have been found in multiple layers of the cave's painting sequence, appearing across different periods of the cave's use, rather than being confined to a single episode. They are not the result of the technique failing or the stencil being partially obscured. The missing elements are consistent across individual prints in ways that suggest the hand itself lacked those digits. The mainstream explanations for the partial handprints fall into two broad categories. The first is ritual finger amputation or binding, a practice documented in various forms across numerous world cultures, sometimes associated with mourning, initiation, or status marking. The second is medical causation. Frostbite in Patagonia's extreme cold could cause the loss of distal finger segments, as could certain infections or congenital conditions. Both explanations are plausible at the level of individual cases. Neither fully accounts for the distribution of partial prints across multiple chronological layers and multiple individuals, which would require either a ritual practice sustained across thousands of years or an unusually high incidence of digit loss in the cave visiting population over that time span. A third interpretation, proposed by some researchers in ethnoarchaeology, suggests the partial handprints were intentional symbolic choices rather than anatomical records, that a hand with missing or modified digits carried a specific communicative meaning within the symbolic vocabulary of the site's users, marking the handprint maker as belonging to a particular group, holding a particular status, or having undergone a particular experience. In this reading, the partial prints are not showing you what the hand looked like. They are showing you what the hand meant. Cueva de las Manos also preserves hunting scenes and images of guanaco, the Andean camelid that formed the basis of Patagonian subsistence economies, depicted in running groups with human figures in pursuit. These scenes are compositionally dynamic and anatomically observant in ways that confirm the site's artists were working with a developed visual language, not making random marks. The handprints and the hunting scenes coexist across the same walls, across the same 8,000 years of use, suggesting the cave served multiple symbolic functions simultaneously, some commemorative, some communicative, some that we have not yet found the framework to interpret. What is certain is this: someone in Patagonia 9,000 years ago pressed a hand against a canyon wall and blew pigment around it. They chose to show you that hand. Some of those hands were not complete. Whatever that meant to the person holding their breath and pressing their palm against the cold stone. They chose to show you that too. From handprints in Patagonia, some of them missing fingers that the record never explains, we fly north across the equator and east across the ocean to southern France, where a room hidden below the most famous painted cave in the world was not the first discovery that shook everything. From cave paintings in the Americas to cave paintings in Africa, we now travel to the tip of the African continent, where the evidence for symbolic human thought does not push back the timeline by a few thousand years. It doubles it. Blombos Cave. 300 kilometers east of Cape Town, on a limestone cliff above the Indian Ocean in the western Cape of South Africa, a sea cave opens onto a view of blue water that has changed beyond recognition since the people who used this cave were alive. 77,000 years ago, the sea level was lower, the climate different, and the cave was set back from the water's edge by a stretch of open land. Someone in that cave picked up a piece of red ochre, prepared its surface, and with deliberate, controlled strokes engraved a crosshatch pattern onto it, a geometric design that fills the prepared surface from edge to edge with a regularity that makes clear it was planned. They kept it. It is the oldest known example of abstract symbolic thinking in the documented history of our species. Blombos Cave was first excavated by Professor Christopher Henshelwood of the University of Bergen beginning in 1991. In 2002, his team published results in Science describing two ochre pieces bearing clear geometric crosshatch designs dated by thermoluminescence of surrounding sediments to approximately 77,000 years before the present. The crosshatch patterns were created through repeated controlled strokes using a lithic point with geometric regularity across the entire prepared surface. They are not random. They are not decorative in the casual sense. They are symbols, deliberately made and deliberately kept by someone who understood that the marks carried meaning. In 2004, the cave yielded 41 shell beads made from the tick shell Nacerius kraussianus, dated to 75,000 years ago, the oldest confirmed personal ornaments ever found anywhere in the world. They show deliberate perforation and traces of red ochre, indicating they were worn against skin and that the ochre coating was intentional. Personal ornamentation requires a concept of self-presentation, an understanding that one's appearance communicates something to others, a capacity for symbolic self-representation that mainstream archaeology in 2004 was not prepared to assign to humans at 75,000 years before the present. The cave also yielded in 2011 two small abalone shells that had been used as containers for a prepared compound of red ochre, bone, charcoal, quartz gravel, and a liquid binder, dated to 100,000 years ago. These are the oldest known paint kits in the world. Preparing this compound required sourcing multiple ingredients from different locations, grinding them to a consistent powder, mixing them with a binder in correct proportions, and storing the result in a container chosen for the purpose. This is not opportunistic behavior. This is multi-step planned production of a specialized material, demonstrating a cognitive architecture capable of sequential planning, material knowledge, and the concept of a future use for a prepared substance. Conventional archaeology placed the emergence of symbolic cognition, the ability to create and use symbols carrying shared meaning, at approximately 40,000 to 50,000 years ago in Europe. A moment sometimes called the creative explosion or the cognitive revolution. Blombos pushes the minimum date for symbolic behavior in our species to 77,000 years ago, and the paint kits to 100,000 years ago in sub-Saharan Africa in a sea cave on the Indian Ocean coast. Every element of what we call distinctly modern human behavior, abstract thought, symbolic marking, planned pigment use, personal ornamentation, existed far earlier and far further from Europe than the dominant model allowed. The mainstream archaeological position has shifted significantly in response to Blombos. Researchers, including Francesco D'Errico of the University of Bordeaux, argue that symbolic behavior evolved gradually in Africa over hundreds of thousands of years before the Homo sapiens diaspora carried it out of the continent in successive waves, beginning approximately 70,000 to 130,000 years ago. In this model, Blombos is the earliest well-preserved evidence of a much longer African tradition, not an anomaly, but the first clear window into a story that began even earlier. But if symbolic cognition was established in southern Africa at 100,000 years ago, and if every human population that left Africa carried it with them, then the behaviors we observe at cave sites across Europe, Southeast Asia, and Australia are not independent parallel developments. They are expressions of a single, enormously ancient tradition that originated on the Indian Ocean coast of Africa and dispersed with the people who left. The creative explosion in Europe was not an explosion. It was an arrival. The question that Blombos leaves behind is not when modern human cognition began. It is how much further back it goes than the earliest evidence we have found. From the Indian Ocean coastline of Africa and the oldest symbolic marks our species is known to have made, shall we travel north across the Mediterranean and northwest into Europe, to the coast of Spain, where uranium-thorium dating of a single red mark has opened a question that the field of paleoanthropology is still working through. El Castillo Cave, a red disk. That is all it is, hand-width, ochre pressed against limestone in the dark of a cave, in the Cantabria region of northern Spain. It sounds unimpressive stated plainly. But uranium-thorium dating has placed that red disk at a minimum age of 40,800 years, at a moment in prehistory when Homo sapiens may not yet have been present in Europe. If the date is correct, and the dating method is well established and widely accepted, the person who made that mark was not our kind of human, they were someone else. And that changes the entire story of who first reached toward a cave wall and decided to leave a mark. El Castillo Cave has been known since 1903, when Hermilio Alcalde del Rio first documented its painted walls in the Cantabrian hills above the Pass River Valley. The cave contains bison, deer, geometric symbols, and negative handprints across its walls, long assumed to date broadly to the same Paleolithic period as Lascaux, somewhere between 17,000 and 20,000 years ago. That assumption was overturned in 2012 when a team led by Dr. Alistair Pike of the University of Southampton published uranium-thorium dating results in the journal Science. The study measured uranium decay within calcium carbonate crusts that had formed over the paintings, giving minimum ages for the art beneath. One red disk came back at a minimum of 40,800 years. Multiple other symbols, dots, lines, claviform shapes returned minimum dates between 35,600 and 37,300 years. These are minimum ages. The actual creation of the red disk could be thousands of years earlier than 40,800, which extends the margin further. Homo sapiens arrived in Western Europe at approximately 43,000 to 41,000 years ago based on current fossil and genomic evidence. The gap between the red disk's minimum date and the earliest known Homo sapiens presence in the region is narrow enough to argue about and wide enough to matter. A 2018 follow-up study in Science by Hoffman and colleagues applied the same uranium-thorium method to 3 other Spanish caves, Ardales, La Pasiega, and Maltravieso, and returned minimum dates of 65,000 years for art in all 3 sites, firmly and unambiguously in Neanderthal time. Neanderthals used pigments for at least 250,000 years before the El Castillo disk based on ochre finds at sites including Maastricht Belvedere in the Netherlands and Cueva de los Aviones in Spain. They were not strangers to the concept of applying color to surfaces. Dr. Joan Zillon of the University of Barcelona, who co-authored the 2018 study and has argued since the early 2000s that Neanderthal symbolic behavior was being systematically underestimated, has described the combined dating evidence as closing the debate rather than opening it. If art older than 65,000 years exists in Spanish caves, and 65,000 years precedes Homo sapiens in Europe by more than 20,000 years, then Neanderthals made art. Not possibly, not perhaps. The math requires it. The mainstream archaeological position has moved substantially since 2012 and especially since 2018. The field no longer generally disputes Neanderthal art making. The discussion has shifted to questions of complexity, continuity, and cultural transmission. Were Neanderthal symbolic practices comparable in sophistication to those of later Homo sapiens, or were they simpler, more sporadic, less culturally embedded? These are genuine and important questions, but they are different questions from the one the field was asking before Pike's study. The field was asking whether Neanderthals could make art. That question is no longer on the table. El Castillo also contains at least 60 negative handprints, made by blowing pigment around a pressed hand, the same technique found in French, Australian, and Indonesian caves separated by tens of thousands of years and thousands of miles of open ocean. No one has yet explained, to the satisfaction of anyone who looks closely at the distribution, why the same specific technique for making a hand visible on a cave wall appears independently, repeatedly, across human populations with no documented contact. The handprint is the oldest recurring human signature. Someone at El Castillo left theirs. Whether that someone was Neanderthal or the first arriving Homo sapiens in Iberia, they were doing something that humans on every inhabited continent eventually chose to do. They pressed their hand against the stone and blew color around it, and the shape of their hand stayed there. They are waiting for us to find it 40,000 years later. From a red disc in Spain and the oldest possible art our species or its nearest relative may have made, we make our final descent, traveling back in time further than any of the other caves in this account, back to the oldest gallery of all, to the cave that started everything, the discovery that in 1994 quietly destroyed almost everything we thought we knew about when the human mind became fully itself. Chauvet Cave. The year is 36,000 BCE. In what will one day be called the Ardèche Gorge of southern France, a person holds a torch into a crack in a limestone cliff above a river that will not exist in recognizable form for another 30 millennia, feels a draft of cool air moving from somewhere inside the rock, and steps through into the dark. What they found in that darkness and what they did there is the subject of a discovery that would not be made again for 36,000 years. And when it was, the scientists who walked in behind their torches stood in front of the walls and struggled to understand what they were looking at, because what they were looking at was not supposed to be possible. On December 18, 1994, speleologists Jean-Marie Chauvet, Eliette Brunel, and Christian Hilaire followed a faint draft of air through a narrow fissure near Vallon-Pont d'Arc in the Ardèche department of southern France. They crawled through, dropped into a cavern, and raised their lights to the walls. What they saw were hundreds of animal paintings: bears, lions, rhinoceroses, horses, mammoths, bison, and deer, covering surface after surface with a visual vocabulary of such technical accomplishment that their first instinct, documented in their own accounts, was that someone had been here recently. The cave had been sealed by a rockfall approximately 27,000 years ago. No one had been inside for 27 millennia. The paintings were 36,000 years old. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal recovered from the paintings themselves, conducted for the French Ministry of Culture, established dates ranging from 36,000 to 32,000 years before the present, placing Chauvet firmly in the Aurignacian cultural period and making its paintings the oldest confirmed cave paintings in Europe at the time of their discovery. 13 different animal species are depicted, including cave lions, woolly rhinoceroses, and cave bears, many of them extinct, rendered with anatomical accuracy that has drawn comment from professional wildlife illustrators. Jean Klotz, archaeologist and rock art specialist who led the first scientific team into the cave, documented deliberate scraping of the cave walls before painting, where the artist cleared the surface to create a smooth, pale canvas, indicating premeditated artistic planning rather than spontaneous mark-making. The panel of horses shows 3 horse heads rendered with overlapping profiles to indicate depth and movement, a compositional technique for conveying three-dimensionality and the passage of time that appears in European academic painting only around the 15th century CE, 30,000 years after it appeared on this wall. A confrontation scene between 2 rhinoceroses shows horn overlap to indicate spatial depth and the recession of one animal behind another. The rhinoceroses are not side by side. They are in space, at different distances from the viewer, and the painting shows this. The techniques required for these compositional choices, perspective, motion, spatial layering, are described in Renaissance art instruction manuals as hard-won discoveries of the scientific study of visual perception. They are present at Chauvet as standard practice. Charcoal sticks used as drawing tools were recovered from the cave floor and radiocarbon dated to between 31,000 and 33,000 years ago, confirming that the materials and the finished art are contemporaneous and that charcoal, as a drawing tool, was in deliberate use. The cave also contains bear skull arrangements of a kind that archaeologists have not dismissed as incidental. One cave bear skull was found placed on a large flat rock in an apparently central position within a chamber, with 30 to 40 other bear skulls arranged around it in a configuration that suggests ritual organization of space rather than habitation debris. The cave shows evidence of both human and bear occupation across its sealed period, but the skull placement is distinct from the scatter pattern of ordinary habitation. Mainstream explanation, held by Klotz and the French Ministry of Culture's Scientific Committee, is that the Chauvet artists were fully modern humans whose cognitive capabilities were identical to ours, and that the apparent sophistication represents the work of naturally talented individuals within communities that had developed artistic traditions which survive poorly in the archaeological record. Art history, in this view, does not begin at Chauvet. Chauvet is simply the earliest well-preserved example of what was already a long human tradition. The sophistication of the work reflects the full modern human brain, which these people had applied to a medium that had been in use for longer than the record shows. But if that explanation is correct, why does the art that comes after Chauvet, in sites that are 10,000 and even 20,000 years younger, appear by almost every technical measure to be less accomplished? Lascaux, dated to approximately 17,000 BCE, is extraordinary. But the horses at Chauvet, with their overlapping profiles and their sense of movement caught mid-breath, make the horses at Lascaux look like earlier attempts at something that had already been perfected. Art history, as we understand it from every other context in which we have studied it, does not work backward. It develops forward. Techniques accumulate, skills build across generations. The idea that the most technically sophisticated examples of a tradition appear at the very beginning of the documented record, and that the tradition then produces comparatively simpler work for the next 20,000 years, has no parallel anywhere in the history of human art. Some researchers have asked whether Chauvet represents not the beginning of a tradition, but the survival of one. Whether the techniques on these walls had been developing for tens of thousands of years in materials that have not survived: wood, hide, bark, skin. Whether what looks like a sudden beginning is actually a late-stage preservation of something much older. Others have pushed the question further. Is it possible that the cognitive and technical capacities visible at Chauvet belong to a tradition that preceded our current model of when those capacities developed? The bare skull arrangement, the premeditated surface preparation, the deliberate use of rock contours to make painted animals appear to move in firelight, the spatial layering that would not be described in writing for 35,000 years. Whatever the Chauvet artists were, they were not at the beginning of something. They were already somewhere. The cave was sealed by a rockfall 27,000 years ago. For 27,000 years, the paintings existed in perfect dark, seen by no one, outlasting the extinction of every animal depicted on the walls, outlasting the glaciers, outlasting the river below the cliff that no longer runs the same course. They waited. They are still there. And the question they raise is not about pigment chemistry or radiocarbon decay curves. It is the question that every cave in this account, in its own way, is asking: how much of what we are is older than we have allowed ourselves to believe? 10 caves, 6 continents, a span of time running from 100,000 years ago at Blombos to 2,000 years ago at Longyu, with the full stretch of human prehistory in between. And across all of them, the same quiet insistence that the standard account has gaps in it. The mainstream view is not wrong to note that each of these anomalies has a conventional explanation. Chauvet's sophistication reflects a modern brain that was already complete. El Castillo's red disk falls within a narrow margin that Homo sapiens might technically have occupied. Yet Blombos represents the earliest documented expression of a gradually developing African tradition. The Denisovans are now incorporated into a revised family tree. Longyu was probably a quarry or storage complex, the records simply lost. Cueva de los Tallos is a remarkable natural cave, whose more spectacular claims were not verified. The shaft scene is a hunting commemoration dressed in ceremonial imagery. Magura's calendar is a pattern that may be in the eye of the observer. Lovelock's reddish hair is a chemical artifact of preservation conditions. Ardales is accepted now as Neanderthal art, and the field has moved on. But the conventional explanations taken together require a series of coincidences that strain against each other. They require artistic sophistication to appear fully formed and then regress. They require symbolic behavior to be present at 100,000 years but leave almost no trace for the next 50,000. They require an undocumented civilization to carve 1 million cubic meters of stone and leave no record in the most literate civilization on Earth. They require a Neanderthal artistic tradition of 25,000 years to have been invisible to science until 2021. And they require a species to be invisible until a child's fingertip revealed its genome. What these caves suggest, taken not separately but as a collection, is that the timeline of human cognition, human culture, and human prehistory is longer, stranger, and more populated than the model we currently use. Not because of conspiracy or suppression, but because the record is fragmentary, because preservation is accidental, because the questions we ask shape the answers we find, and because the easiest assumption in any era of science is that we have already found the important things. You came to this video, and you stayed through 10 caves. Most people encounter these discoveries as footnotes, as curiosities filed under ancient mysteries and then set aside. You did not set them aside. You kept asking. That is not a small thing. The people who change what we understand about the past are the ones who cannot. Stop asking why the official explanation leaves something out. Who noticed that the anomaly at the edge of the frame is more interesting than the thing in the center? Who go back to the source material and find that it says something different from what the textbook said it said? Subscribe, because the caves in this account are a fraction of what has been found and is still being found. And leave a comment. Which of these 10 discoveries do you think holds the thread that, when pulled, will change what we know about where we come from? These caves were never meant to last 36,000 years. The people who descended into them by firelight, who pressed their hands against cold limestone, who mixed bat droppings with water and counted the days of the solar year in the dark, did not know we would find what they left. They left it anyway, not for us, not for posterity, but because the act of marking the wall meant something to them in the moment they did it. That impulse to reach toward the stone and say, "This matters, this happened, I was here," has not changed in 100,000 years. Every person who has ever looked at the world and felt compelled to record it is doing the same thing the Blombos engraver did, the same thing the Chauvet painter did, the same thing every hand pressed against every cave wall has always done. The walls are still speaking. Subscribe and keep listening.